The autumn wind moved through Greenwood Cemetery with a quiet grace, carrying a crisp chill that rustled brittle, golden, brown leaves along the stone pathways. The faint crunch underfoot echoed in the silence of the place where memories outnumbered the living, and stories whispered through weathered headstones. Alexander Carter stepped out of his black Cadillac, the glossy paint catching a fleeting reflection of gray clouds above. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, the fabric smooth beneath his fingers, a habitual gesture for a man accustomed to power and control. CEO of one of the world's largest tech empires, his days were usually filled with mergers, negotiations, boardrooms thick with strategy. But not today. Today wasn't about power or deals or the empire he had built with ruthless precision. Today marked 5 years. 5 long years since Evelyn. 5 years since the only person who had ever truly known him was taken away. Every year on this day he came here. No entourage, no schedule, no pretense. Just him and the silence he never quite escaped. His expensive shoes made dull sounds against the gravel as he walked the familiar path, his heart heavier with each step. No matter how many times he made this pilgrimage, it never became easier. But today something was different. He saw it even before he understood it. A small figure seated quietly beside Evelyn's grave. At first Alexander thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast strangely against the stone. But then the boy moved, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his head bent low. He couldn't have been older than 6 and maybe 7. Dressed in a thin, faded jacket far too light for the sharp cold in the air. His brown hair messy, his small frame still. And when he lifted his head, when his pale face turned toward Alexander, there was something in his eyes. Something that froze Alexander in place. A deep sadness lived in those eyes. But that wasn't what stopped him. It was familiarity, a reflection of something, someone he thought he had lost forever. Alexander's breath hitched, his pulse picking up speed. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the usual authority that came so easily in other rooms. His voice was lower than usual, worry but firm. "Hey, kid, are you lost?" The boy didn't move at first. His gaze steady, locked onto Alexander with an intensity far too knowing for someone so young. Then he shook his head just once. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "No, I came to see my mom." Alexander's chest tightened. The cold air suddenly felt thinner, harder to breathe. He took a step forward, then another, his polished shoes crunching against gravel that sounded louder now. He glanced at the grave, at the name etched into the marble. Evelyn Carter. "What did you say?" His voice was sharp now, too sharp. But he couldn't help it. The world was tilting, shifting in ways he couldn't control. The boy didn't flinch. He simply pointed toward the headstone. "My mom." Alexander's hands clenched, the leather of his gloves creaking faintly. His mind scrambled for logic, for sense. Evelyn had never been pregnant. They had talked about it late nights when they still believed they had time. But life had gotten in the way. His work, her patience, their quiet sacrifices, and then she was gone. And no, this boy, sitting here, speaking words that made no sense. He knelt down slowly, his knees stiff, his breath uneven. He studied the child's face, the delicate features, the curve of his mouth, the shape of his eyes. Soft brown eyes just like hers. He felt something sharp twist in his gut, an ache he hadn't expected. The boy watched him, waiting. "What's your name?" Alexander asked it softer now, almost afraid of the answer. "Liam," the boy replied. The name meant nothing to Alexander. But the weight of it, the certainty in the boy's voice, that was everything. Alexander's mind was a storm. This couldn't be real. Yet the evidence was staring back at him. A living, breathing piece of Evelyn, one he never knew existed. His throat felt tight as he forced out another question. "Where do you live, Liam?" The boy's gaze dropped, his small fingers tracing the edge of the marble stone with gentle care. "At the shelter in Brooklyn," he said quietly. "They take care of me there." A fresh wave of disbelief crashed over Alexander. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to process it. Evelyn's son living in a shelter. While he had spent years drowning in grief, building his empire higher, her child had been surviving alone. How? Why? He needed answers, but the questions piled up faster than he could voice them. "Who told you she was your mother?" Alexander managed to ask. Liam's voice wavered. "Miss Joan." At the shelter, she said my mommy loved me, but she had to leave me when I was a baby. She used to visit sometimes, but then she stopped. Alexander closed his eyes, swallowing hard against the emotion threatening to choke him. Evelyn had been visiting him. A secret life. A child left in the shadows and him, never knowing. Why had she done this? Why had she hidden something so life-changing from him? Had she been afraid of what he'd say, of what he'd do? He knelt there, feeling the weight of it all settle over him. This wasn't a problem he could solve with strategy. It wasn't a crisis he could fix by writing a check. This was something raw, something personal. And at the center of it was a little boy staring up at him, waiting. Alexander took a deep, shaky breath. He had no answers yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away. Alexander remained kneeling for a long moment, his mangling, struggling to steady itself in the middle of this storm. His hands, so often sure and decisive, hovered for a second before resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Liam's small frame was tense beneath his palm, but he didn't pull away. There was something in that, something Alexander wasn't ready to name, but he felt it all the same. He rose slowly to his feet, his breath clouding in the cold air. His gaze drifted from the boy to Evelyn's name carved into stone, as if hoping it would offer an explanation. But the granite stayed silent, offering no mercy. "Come with me," Alexander said at last, his voice low but steady. Liam hesitated. His eyes flicked between the grave and the man who had suddenly entered his world. After a pause, he nodded. Small fingers slipped in Alexander's hand, surprising him with their warmth. It was a simple gesture, but it reached a place inside him that he'd long since locked away. They walked toward the car in silence, the sound of their steps mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. When they reached the Cadillac, Alexander opened the passenger door, watching as Liam climbed inside cautiously, his wide eyes scanning the luxurious interior. Alexander circled to the driver's side, sliding in behind the wheel. His hands gripped the leather tightly, grounding himself in the familiarity of control, even if it was slipping from him in every other way. The engine purred to life, and they pulled away from the cemetery, the rearview mirror shrinking the sight of Evelyn's grave until it vanished behind them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the car was all that filled the space between them, smooth streets, blurred lights, the hollow quiet. "Brooklyn," Alexander said quietly, glancing over at Liam. "That's where the shelter is." Liam nodded, staring out the window. "Yeah." Alexander exhaled slowly through his nose. "We'll go there first." He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he needed answers. He needed facts. Everything about this night had stripped away the certainty he always relied on, and that wasn't a feeling he was prepared to live with. They drove in silence through the streets of New York, passing by in a blur. The lights of the city glittered against Liam's pale face, making his expression unreadable. Alexander stole a glance now and then, but the boy didn't meet his eyes again. He stayed quiet, small fingers tugging nervously at the cuff of his worn jacket, a jacket that was too thin for the season and too threadbare for a child who should have had more. By the time they reached the shelter, Alexander's stomach was in knots. He hadn't felt this level of uncertainty since he was a young man sitting in a cheap suit across from his first investor. Only this time it wasn't about business. This wasn't about risk and reward. It was about Evelyn, and this boy who might be his son. The shelter was a tired building squeezed between two larger apartment complexes. The bricks were weathered, the paint peeling near the windows. Alexander parked at the curb, shutting off the engine with a sharp twist of his wrist. Liam was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his small hands moving faster now, as if eager to be back somewhere familiar. "Wait," Alexander said before he could open the door. "Stay with me." Liam nodded again, and together they crossed the cracked pavement toward the entrance. The door creaked on its hinges when Alexander pushed it open, the warm air inside smelling faintly of old books, disinfectant, and something Alexander couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, just tired. A woman at the front desk looked up as they entered. She was older, mid-60s, maybe with silver hair pulled into a bun and round glasses that slid halfway down her nose. She blinked, then smiled at Liam, though it faltered when her eyes shifted to Alexander. "Back already, sweetheart?" she said kindly to Liam. Then, more cautious, to Alexander. And you are? Alexander Carter, he said, simply reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card. He set it down on the desk with a quiet, deliberate tap. I need to speak with Miss Joan. The woman's eyes flickered with recognition. She picked up the card, reading it slowly, then gave a tight nod. Wait here. She disappeared down a hallway, leaving Alexander and Liam standing in the lobby. The space was small but neat. Shelves filled with books lined one wall, and a few mismatched chairs were tucked into corners. A bulletin board was pinned with colorful artwork clearly drawn by young hands. Alexander's eyes caught one picture in particular, a woman with dark hair standing next to a little boy under a crooked sun. The name scrawled beneath in a child's handwriting, Mommy and Liam. His chest tightened, the air around him seeming thinner again. Footsteps returned and an older woman appeared in the doorway. She was small with a wary frame and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her gray hair was short and her face was lined but kind. She looked at Liam first, smiling softly, then turned to Alexander. Mr. Carter, she greeted calmly. I wonder when you'd come. Alexander frowned. You knew who I was. She nodded, folding her hands in front of her. Evelyn told me, long ago. She made me promise not to contact you. Why? His voice was tight, the word bitten out before he could smooth it. Miss Jones sighed, her gaze steady. Because she thought it was the only way to protect you both. From what? Alexander pressed. From the pain, Jones said softly. From the questions. From the impossible choices. Alexander's hands curled at his sides. He didn't know if it was anger or grief, but it simmered just beneath his skin. He turned to look at Liam, who was staring at the floor, his small shoulders hunched. What happens to him now? Alexander asked, his voice quieter. That's up to you, Joan answered, her expression unwavering. He has no family left. No guardians. He stays here unless you choose otherwise. Alexander let the weight of it sink in. He hadn't chosen this. But standing here watching Liam, he realized he didn't need to. He reached out, resting his hand lightly on Liam's shoulder again. Come on, kid, he said quietly. Let's go. Liam's head lifted, his wide eyes searching Alexander's face. There was a flicker there, hope, cautious, but real. Without a word, Liam followed him. And as they stepped back out into the cold night air, Alexander knew he had just made the most important decision of his life. Alexander remained kneeling for a long moment, his mind struggling to steady itself in the middle of this storm. His hands, so often sure and decisive, hovered for a second before resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Liam's small frame was tense beneath his palm, but he didn't pull away. There was something in that. Something Alexander wasn't ready to name, but he felt it all the same. He rose slowly to his feet, his breath clouding in the cold air. His gaze drifted from the boy to Evelyn's name carved into stone, as if hoping it would offer an explanation. But the granite stayed silent, offering no mercy. Come with me, Alexander said at last, his voice low but steady. Liam hesitated. His eyes flicked between the grave and the man who had suddenly entered his world. After a pause, he nodded. Small fingers slipped into Alexander's hand, surprising him with their warmth. It was a simple gesture, but it reached a place inside him that he'd long since locked away. They walked toward the car in silence, the sound of their steps mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. When they reached the Cadillac, Alexander opened the passenger door, watching as Liam climbed inside cautiously, his wide eyes scanning the luxurious interior. Alexander circled to the driver's side, sliding in behind the wheel. His hands gripped the leather tightly, grounding himself in the familiarity of control, even if it was slipping from him in every other way. The engine purred to life, and they pulled away from the cemetery, the rearview mirror, shrinking the sight of Evelyn's grave until it vanished behind them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the car was all that filled the space between them, smooth streets, blurred lights, the hollow quiet. Brooklyn, Alexander said quietly, glancing over at Liam. That's where the shelter is. Liam nodded, staring out the window. Yeah. Alexander exhaled slowly through his nose. We'll go there first. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he needed answers. He needed facts. Everything about this night had stripped away the certainty he had always relied on, and that wasn't a feeling he was prepared to live with. They drove in silence, the streets of New York passing by in a blur. The lights of the city glittered against Liam's pale face, making his expression unreadable. Alexander stole a glance now and then, but the boy didn't meet his eyes again. He stayed quiet, small fingers tugging nervously at the cuff of his worn jacket. A jacket that was too thin for the season and too threadbare for a child who should have had more. By the time they reached the shelter, Alexander's stomach was in knots. He hadn't felt this level of uncertainty since he was a young man sitting in a cheap suit across from his first investor. Only this time it wasn't about business. This wasn't about risk and reward. It was about Evelyn, and this boy who might be his son. The shelter was a tired building squeezed between two larger apartment complexes. The bricks were weathered, the paint peeling near the windows. Alexander parked at the curb, shutting off the engine with a sharp twist of his wrist. Liam was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his small hands moving faster now, as if eager to be back somewhere familiar. "Wait," Alexander said before he could open the door. "Stay with me." Liam nodded again, and together they crossed the cracked pavement toward the entrance. The door creaked on its hinges when Alexander pushed it open, the warm air inside smelling faintly of old books, disinfectant, and something Alexander couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, just tired. A woman at the front desk looked up as they entered. She was older, mid-60s, maybe with silver hair pulled into a bun and round glasses that slid halfway down her nose. She blinked, then smiled at Liam, though it faltered when her eyes shifted to Alexander. "Back already, sweetheart," she said kindly to Liam. Then, more cautious, to Alexander. "And you are?" "Alexander Carter," he said simply, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card. He set it down on the desk with a quiet, deliberate tap. "I need to speak with Miss Joan." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition. She picked up the card, reading it slowly, then gave a tight nod. "Wait here." She disappeared down a hallway, leaving Alexander and Liam standing in the lobby. The space was small but neat. Shelves filled with books lined one wall, and a few mismatched chairs were tucked into corners. A bulletin board was pinned with colorful artwork, clearly drawn by young hands. Alexander's eyes caught one picture in particular, a woman with dark hair standing next to a little boy under a crooked sun. The name scrawled beneath in a child's handwriting, Mommy and Liam. His chest tightened, the air around him seeming thinner again. Footsteps returned, and an older woman appeared in the doorway. She was small, with a wary frame and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her gray hair was short and her face was lined but kind. She looked at Liam first, smiling softly, then turned to Alexander. "Mr. Carter," she greeted calmly. "I wondered when you'd come." Alexander frowned. "You knew who I was?" She nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "Evelyn told me. Long ago. She made me promise not to contact you." "Why?" His voice was tight, the word bitten out before he could smooth it. Miss Jones sighed, her gaze steady. "Because she thought it was the only way to protect you both." "From what?" Alexander pressed. "From the pain," Jones said softly. "From the questions. From the impossible choices." Alexander's hands curled at his sides. He didn't know if it was anger or grief, but it simmered just beneath his skin. He turned to look at Liam, who was staring at the floor, his small shoulders hunched. "What happens to him now?" Alexander asked, his voice quieter. "That's up to you." Joan answered, her expression unwavering. "He has no family left, no guardians. He stays here unless you choose otherwise." Alexander let the weight of it sink in. He hadn't chosen this. But standing here watching Liam, he realized he didn't need to. He reached out, resting his hand lightly on Liam's shoulder again. "Come on, kid," he said quietly. "Let's go." Liam's head lifted, his wide eyes searching Alexander's face. There was a flicker there, hopey, cautious, but real. Without a word, Liam followed him. And as they stepped back out into the cold night air, Alexander knew he had just made the most. The city lights shimmered like distant stars as Alexander drove through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Liam sat beside him in the passenger seat, his head leaning against the window, watching the world blur past in streaks of gold and silver. Neither of them spoke. There were too many thoughts, too many unspoken questions hanging in the air like fog. But for now, silence seemed easier. When they reached the building, Alexander's penthouse loomed above like a fortress in the clouds. The elevator ride was slow, and in its quiet hum, Alexander found himself stealing glances at Liam. The boy's gaze was distant, but his small frame seemed steadier somehow, as if the weight he carried had shifted. Alexander wasn't sure if that was a good thing. He wasn't sure of much anymore. The doors slid open, and they stepped into the vast space that Alexander called home. Floor to ceiling windows showcased the Manhattan skyline, stretching out in endless lights. Sleek furniture, cold marble countertops, everything in its place. It was immaculate, impressive, and suddenly it felt empty. Liam's shoes made no sound on the polished floors as he wandered deeper into the room, his fingers trailing over the smooth surfaces of tables and shelves. He paused in front of a framed photo on the sideboard, Evelyn's smile frozen in time, her eyes warm alive. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the glass. Alexander watched him, something tugging inside him that he couldn't name. He set the keys down, the faint clink echoing in the quiet. "Are you hungry?" Alexander asked, his voice soft but steady. Liam nodded, still staring at the photo. "A little." Alexander moved to the kitchen, opening the refrigerator. It was stocked what he always kept. Things prepared by chefs. Meals in glass containers, wine, mineral water. Nothing that belonged in a home with a child. He sighed quietly, reaching for bread, cheese, butter. Simple things. He made grilled cheese the way he remembered from long ago, before wealth, before everything. The smell filled the space, warm, familiar. Liam sat at the counter, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes followed Alexander's movements, curious but silent. When the sandwich was placed in front of him, he offered a small, almost shy, "Thanks." Alexander poured him a glass of water, then leaned back against the counter, watching as the boy took small bites, chewing slowly. It was the most normal moment they'd shared yet, and somehow that made it all the more strange. "You don't have to be quiet," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "You can talk." Liam looked up, a flicker of something in his eyes. "I'm used to quiet," he said simply. Alexander nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. He finished his own drink, and they ate in silence again. But it didn't feel as heavy this time. Later, Alexander found himself in his offices, scrolling through files Daniel had sent over. Records and documents, everything there was to know about Liam's past. It was all there in black and white, but none of it answered the questions weighing on him. He heard soft footsteps and turned to find Liam standing at the doorway, clutching one of the books Rebed had given him. "Can I sit here?" Liam asked. Alexander gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course." The boy settled in, opening his book, curling his legs beneath him like he belonged there. Alexander watched him for a long moment before turning back to the screen. But he didn't read another word. Time passed quietly. Eventually, Liam's eyelids grew heavy, his head drooping. Alexander stood, moving quietly to lift him from the chair. The boy stirred but didn't wake. He was lighter than he expected, fragile, in a way that made Alexander's chest tighten. He carried Liam to the guest room, the one Rebecca had insisted they set up for him. The bed was already made, his soft blankets pulled back. He laid the boy down, carefully pulling the covers over him. For a long time he just stood there, watching the steady rise and fall of Liam's breath, wondering how things had come to this. Alexander Carter, the man who built empires, who sat at the helm of billion-dollar companies, was now standing in a quiet room, watching over a sleeping child. When he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, he realized something had shifted, and there was no turning back. The following days settled into something resembling routine, though it was unfamiliar territory for Alexander. Breakfast in the morning, dropping Liam off for his new tutor, in the afternoons, dinners at a table that had once been used only for meetings. It was strange and it was exhausting, but it was beginning to feel like something real. Until the call came. He was in his office late one evening reviewing contracts when his phone buzzed. "Daniel." "Mark Donovan knows," Daniel said without preamble. Alexander's fingers tightened around the phone. "How?" "He has people everywhere," Daniel replied. Probably caught wind the moment we started asking questions. Alexander swore under his breath. What's he doing? He's playing it smart. For now. But he'll make his move soon. Alexander's gaze drifted toward the window. The city sprawled beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered, and yet none of it mattered. Not when it came to this. Keep me updated, he said tightly. Daniel's voice softened. He's not backing down, Alexander. You need to be ready. He ended the call, his mind already racing. Mark Donovan was a man who didn't take no for an answer, and he wasn't going to be satisfied knowing he had a son somewhere in the city. Alexander stepped out of his office, walking slowly toward the guest room. He opened the door, watching Liam sleep peaceful, unaware. For now, but the storm was coming, and Alexander knew this time he wouldn't be able to fight it with contracts or corporate takeovers. He'd have to fight for something far more important. The next morning, the city was washed in a pale gray light, soft rain, streaking the windows of Alexander's penthouse. He stood in the kitchen, staring out over the skyline, coffee cooling in his hand. The weight of Daniel's call the night before still pressed heavily on his mind. Mark Donovan knew, and if Mark knew, it was only a matter of time before he acted. Alexander was used to preempting moves, predicting his opponent's strategy before they made it. But this wasn't a corporate battle. There were no negotiation tables, no contracts to sign. This was about Liam, and it wasn't a game he could afford to lose. Behind him, he heard quiet footsteps. Liam shuffled into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes, hair sticking up in all directions. He crossed to the table and sat down without a word. Alexander turned, setting his coffee aside. Sleep okay? He asked, keeping his tone casual. Liam shrugged, then nodded. Yeah. Alexander moved to the stove, cracked 2 eggs into a pan, and let the silence stretch comfortably between them. He wasn't going to push Liam for conversation, but the boy surprised him. Is he coming? Liam asked quietly. Alexander glanced over his shoulder. Mark. Liam nodded, his hands fiddling with the hem of his sleeve. Alexander sighed, flipping the eggs over slowly. He knows, but he hasn't made a move yet. Liam was quiet for a moment then. Will he try to take me? The question wasn't loaded with fear, not like Alexander expected. It was just matter of fact. But it cut deeper because of it. I won't let that happen, Alexander said simply. Liam's gaze lifted, studying him, as if weighing the truth in those words. Finally, he nodded once and looked away. But something in his face eased. Just a little. They ate breakfast quietly, and by mid-morning, Liam was working with his tutor in the study. Alexander stood nearby, pretending to read reports while his mind raced in a dozen different directions. By early afternoon, the decision was made. He picked up the phone, dialing Daniel. Want to meet him? Alexander said, his voice low but firm. Daniel didn't ask who. Tonight. There was a pause. You sure? Alexander's gaze drifted toward the study, where Liam was quietly working. Yeah, I'm sure. The meeting was set for 7 at Donovan's private office, an ivory tower of glass and steel in Midtown. Alexander spent the afternoon making arrangements, briefing his legal team, ensuring every angle was covered. He wasn't walking into this without armor. As the sun slipped below the city skyline, Alexander left Liam in Rebecca's care, giving him only a simple explanation. I've got a meeting, he said. I'll be back soon. Liam didn't ask questions. He only nodded. But Alexander saw it in his eyes, that flicker of understanding. Liam knew who the meeting was with, and why. The car ride to Donovan's headquarters was quiet. Alexander sat in the back seat, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. On the outside, he was calm, but inside every muscle was coiled tight, every instinct on edge. He was used to walking into negotiations knowing he would win. Tonight, he wasn't sure there was a victory to claim. The building's lobby gleamed under white lights, polished marble floors echoing with every footstep. He was escorted by a silent assistant to a private elevator, then to a conference room at the top floor. Mark Donovan was already there, standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned as Alexander entered, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. Alexander. Mark greeted, his voice smooth. Controlled. Alexander said nothing at first, simply crossed to the table and sat down. His movement slow, deliberate. They stared at each other for a long moment, two powerful men, neither willing to break first. Finally, Mark spoke. "You've been busy." Alexander's jaw tightened. Protecting Liam isn't busy work. Mark's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "I'm not here to take him away." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "No, I'm here because I want to know him," Mark said simply. "I deserve that." "You deserve nothing," Alexander replied, his voice low. "You weren't there?" "I didn't know he existed." Mark shot back, his calm cracking for the first time. "Evelyn made that choice. Not me." Alexander said nothing, letting the silence hang heavy between them. Mark exhaled, then sat down across from him. "I don't want to fight you," he said. "But I will, if you force me to." Alexander's fingers drummed once against the table. "And if Liam doesn't want to see you." Mark's gaze hardened. "He's a child. He doesn't know what he needs." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "He knows what he doesn't need. Another man who wants to control him." For a beat, Mark didn't respond. Then slowly he nodded. "You're not wrong," he said. "I built an empire at the cost of things I'll never get back, but I'm not here to repeat those mistakes." Alexander studied him. He wanted to believe him, but he couldn't trust a man like Donovan so easily. "Lamb's not a business merger," Alexander said finally. "And he's not a name on a document. If you want a relationship with him, you don't do it through lawyers. You do it on his terms." Mark was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. "All right," he said. "On his terms." Alexander stood. "I'll tell him." As he turned to go, Mark's voice stopped him. "You care about him." Alexander paused, then looked back. "Yeah, I do." Mark's expression softened, just slightly. "Then maybe we're not enemies." Alexander held his gaze for a long moment. "We'll see." And then he left. The ride back to the penthouse was quiet again, but something inside Alexander had shifted. He wasn't sure if it was hope, or something like it. When he got home, Liam was waiting in the living room, curled up in the corner of the couch, his eyes wide. "How'd it go?" Liam asked. Alexander crossed to him, sat down slowly. "It's up to you," he said simply. "If you want to see him again, you can. If you don't, you won't." Liam was quiet for a long time. Then quietly, "I think I do, just once. To see." Alexander nodded. "Then we'll set it up." Liam hesitated, then leaned against him. It was a small gesture, but it made something in Alexander's chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. He rested a hand on Liam's shoulder, holding him there. For now, this was enough. But the future was coming. And Alexander knew they'd face it together. The following days passed with a strange quietness that neither Alexander nor Liam fully understood. There was an unspoken tension that hung in the air. Even though neither of them said much about it, Liam continued his routine. Mornings with the tutor Rebecca had found for him, afternoons reading in the library or exploring the edges of the penthouse. But Alexander noticed the way the boy would sometimes stop whatever he was doing and just stare out the window, his thoughts clearly somewhere else. He understood that feeling all too well. There was a certain weight that came with waiting for something you weren't sure you wanted. One evening, as the sky outside deepened into a dusky violet, Alexander stood in the doorway of the study, watching Liam work through an assignment. The boy had grown quieter lately, his words fewer, his expression harder to read. Alexander wasn't sure how to reach him, but he knew he had to try. He cleared his throat softly, stepping into the room. "I spoke with Mark today," he said, his voice calm but direct. Liam didn't look up right away. His pencil hovered over the page, as if he were considering something he couldn't quite put into words. Then, slowly, he set it down. "What did he say?" Liam asked, not quite meeting his eyes. Alexander crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him. "He said he wants to take you out. Just the two of you. No pressure. He wants to get to know you." There was a pause, and then Alexander added, "But only if you want to." Liam's fingers played with the edge of his sleeve. He stayed quiet for a long time. Alexander let him take his time. Finally, Liam sighed. "Maybe. I don't know. What if he's like different than I thought?" Alexander tilted his head. "Different how?" Liam shrugged. "I don't know. What if he doesn't like me? Or what if I don't like him?" Alexander leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Then you figure it out. But it's your choice." Not his. Not mine. He paused, then added, "You don't have to like him. You don't even have to forgive him. You just have to do what's right for you." Liam looked up at him then, his eyes searching. "What if I'm not sure?" Alexander gave a small nod. "Then we take it slow." And that was all they said about it for the rest of the night. The meeting was set for the following Saturday afternoon. A quiet place. Donovan had chosen a private art gallery. Neutral ground, somewhere that might feel less intimidating. Alexander had approved it. He was protective of Liam, but he also knew that shielding the boy from everything would only make him feel more powerless. When they arrived, Mark was already there, standing near one of the exhibits. The gallery was nearly empty, its white walls and high ceilings casting everything in a muted, soft light. Liam stood frozen at first, his shoulders tight, his jaw clenched. But Alexander placed a steady hand on his back. "I'll be right here," he said quietly. Liam gave a small noji, then stepped forward. Mark noticed him immediately, his expression change, less guarded, less polished, for the first time since Alexander had met him, human. Mark said. His voice was quieter than Liam expected. "Thanks for coming." Liam didn't answer right away. He looked around at the paintings on the wall, pretending to be interested. But then he glanced back at Mark and gave a small, awkward shrug. "It's fine." The two of them walked slowly through the gallery. They didn't talk much at first. Mark pointed out a painting here and there, asked Liam what he thought. Liam's answers were short but not cold. Alexander watched from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. After a while, Mark sat down on one of the benches in the middle of the room. He glanced over at Liam. "Do you like to draw?" he asked. Liam shrugged again. "Sometimes." Mark nodded slowly. "Your mom used to sketch all the time. She had this notebook she kept in her bag. She'd draw things when she thought no one was watching." Liam glanced at him sideways. "I didn't know that." Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah. She was really good. She never let me see most of them. Said they were for herself." He let out a breath. "I guess there was a lot she kept for herself." Liam didn't answer. But he sat down next to Mark on the bench. They were quiet for a long time, just sitting there. Alexander watched the scene unfold from where he stood, feeling something he couldn't quite name stirring in his chest. Later, when they were leaving, Mark turned to Liam one last time. "This doesn't have to be all at once," he said. "We can take it slow." Liam gave a small nod. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't closing himself off either. When they got back into Alexander's car, the boy let out a breath as if he'd been holding it for hours. Alexander didn't push him. He just let him be. Sometimes silence was the only answer that made sense. That night, as Liam sat on the couch with one of his books, Alexander watched him carefully. "How is it?" he asked quietly. Liam shrugged. He admitted. "But not bad." Alexander nodded once. That was all he needed to hear. Days passed, and Mark kept his word. He didn't push. He sent a message here and there, sometimes asking if Liam wanted to meet again, sometimes sharing a memory about Evelyn. Liam didn't always respond, but he read every message, and Alexander knew he was thinking about it. Then one night, as Alexander was reading in the living room, Liam walked up to him with his phone in his hand. "Can I call him?" he asked quietly. Alexander looked up and nodded. "Of course." Liam sat down beside him and made the call. Mark picked up after 2 rings, and they talked. It wasn't long, but it was enough. Alexander didn't listen to the conversation. He didn't need to. He just stayed there beside Liam, solid, present. Later, when Liam had gone to bed, Alexander found himself standing by the window, staring out at the lights of the city. He thought about Evelyn, about the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept, and he wondered if this, what they had now, was what she had wanted all along. Maybe. Maybe not. But it was theirs now. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander wasn't afraid of what came next. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the way they used to be. It wasn't the kind of silence that weighed heavy or left you feeling like something was missing. It was a peaceful sort of quiet, one that settled in slowly, like the first snowfall of winter. Gentle, steady, almost unnoticed at first. But then it was just there, filling the spaces that used to feel hollow. Liam had started calling Mark once a week. Sometimes they met for lunch. Sometimes they just talked on the phone. And Alexander, as much as he had prepared himself to resist, found he was slowly letting go of his need to control it. He watched Liam handle it on his own terms. No one was forcing him. No one was pushing him into anything. It was his choice of, and Alexander was beginning to realize that was the most important thing. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of the penthouse, Alexander found himself glancing at Liam, who was reading quietly in his chair. The boy was different now, stronger maybe, or maybe he was just finally allowed to be himself. Alexander couldn't be sure. "You're not afraid anymore," Alexander said, almost without thinking. Liam looked up from his book, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" Alexander leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You used to look around like you were waiting for something bad to happen. You don't do that anymore." Liam was quiet for a long time. Then he closed the book in his lap. "I guess I was waiting for you to leave," he admitted. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that made Alexander's chest tighten. "I'm not going anywhere," Alexander said. Liam nodded slowly, like maybe he believed it now. They sat there for a while longer, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It was the kind of silence Alexander never thought he would miss if it were gone. But he knew now he would. The next week, Liam asked about Evelyn, not in the way he used to, not looking for answers that no one had. He just wanted to know things about her. What she was like on a Tuesday. Whether she liked her coffee black or with milk. Whether she left dishes in the sink or always cleaned them right away. And Alexander told him every little detail he could remember. How she laughed too loudly in fancy restaurants. How she sang along to old jazz records when she thought no one was listening. How she cried the night he told her he was selling the old house because it was too full of things they couldn't bring with them. She said it felt like leaving memories behind. And Alexander, he realized in that moment, telling Liam these stories, that he hadn't really said them out loud before. It was like breathing out after holding your breath for years. One night, Liam found an old photo album tucked away in the back of Alexander's closet. He brought it out and sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through the pages slowly. Alexander came in and sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. They didn't say much, just looked. The pictures told stories all on their own. Evelyn in Paris, Evelyn in the garden at their summer home, Evelyn holding a glass of wine and laughing so hard it was blurry. Liam traced his fingers over one picture, where Evelyn was sitting at the piano. "Did she play?" he asked. Alexander nodded. "She loved it. She said it helped her think." Liam looked at him. "Do you still have it?" Alexander smiled faintly. "It's in storage. I didn't think I needed it anymore." Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe we can get it back." And just like that, Alexander realized he missed the sound of music in the house. The piano arrived the next week. Movers brought it into the penthouse and placed it by the big windows. Liam sat at it right away, running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. "I don't know how to play," he said. Alexander sat in the chair nearby. "We'll find someone to teach you." Liam didn't answer. But that night, Alexander heard the soft sound of keys being pressed. Slow, hesitant, but it was a start. Days turned into weeks, and something about the rhythm of their lives began to feel real. Normal, or as close to normal as Alexander Carter's life had ever been. Liam started school. Alexander found himself leaving meetings earlier just to be home for dinner. Rebecca told him once that she barely recognized him these days. He only smiled, but it wasn't perfect. There were hard days. Liam had nightmares sometimes. Alexander would find him standing by the window in the middle of the night, staring out at the city. He never said what the dreams were about. Alexander never asked. He just stood there beside him until Liam was ready to go back to bed. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered. Mark Donovan's seal on the front. Alexander opened it in his study, his hands steady even as his stomach tightened. The message was clear. Mark wanted joint custody. He was filing for it officially. Alexander closed the letter slowly, exhaled through his nose. He had known this would come. Mark Donovan was not a man who stayed on the sidelines. But knowing didn't make it easier. That evening, Alexander sat Liam down at the dining table. "There's something you need to know," he said. Liam listened as Alexander explained the letter, the custody request, what it could mean. Liam was quiet for a long time after. Then he said, "Do I have to choose?" Alexander shook his head. "No, we'll fight it, if that's what you want." Really? Looked at him. Then he nodded once. "I want to stay here." Alexander reached across the table, his hand resting on Liam's. "Then we'll make sure that happens." There was a storm coming. Alexander could feel it. Mark Donovan wasn't going to back down, but neither was he. For the first time in years, Alexander Carter wasn't fighting for his company or his reputation or his place in the world. He was fighting for someone else, for family. The courtroom smelled of old wood and quiet tension, the kind of place where lives are rewritten with the stroke of a pen. Alexander sat at the long polished table, his hands folded calmly in front of him. Across the room, Mark Donovan was the picture of composed confidence. His sharp suit, his straight back, everything about him screamed control. But Alexander wasn't intimidated. Not this time. Not when Liam's future was at stake. Liam wasn't there. He didn't need to be. Alexander had made sure of that. There was no reason to put him through this, no reason to make him sit there and watch two powerful men fight over him like a contract. He deserved better than that. The judge entered the room. The proceedings began, and for a while it was all legal jargon. Documents, custody petitions, statements. Alexander listened. He watched. But when it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly, every move deliberate. He didn't talk about his wealth or the life he could give Liam. He didn't list his assets or recite the titles of his companies. None of that mattered here. Instead, he spoke about the boy who had shown up at Evelyn's grave. Alone, lost. How that boy had walked into his life and made a home where there hadn't been one in years. He talked about Liam's quiet strength, his resiliency, and his right to stability. When Mark took the stand, his words were smooth. Practiced. He spoke about regret, about missed chances. He said all the right things, but Alexander could see the cracks beneath the polished veneer, the flashes of impatience, the tightness in his jaw when the judge pressed him on why he had never tried to find Evelyn, why he hadn't questioned the possibility of a child. When it was over, they left the courtroom in silence. Outside, Mark approached him. His gaze was sharp but less sure than before. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Alexander met his gazes, steady and unflinching. "No," he said. "It's not, but it's not your decision anymore." Mark's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, just turned and walked away. Alexander exhaled slowly. He wasn't naive. He knew Mark Donovan wasn't the type to give up easily. But he also knew he wasn't alone in this. And that made all the difference. When he got home, Liam was sitting on the couch, his book in his lap but unopened. He looked up as Alexander walked in. "How did it go?" Alexander crossed the room, lowering himself into the chair across from him. "We made our case," he said. "No, we wait." Liam nodded slowly. His fingers tightened on the edge of the book. "Do you think he'll win?" Alexander shook his head. "No, I think we already have." The days that followed were tense. Every time the phone rang, Alexander felt it in his chest. Every time there was a knock at the door, he expected bad news. But through it all, he stayed steady. For Liam. And then the decision came. It was a Thursday morning. Overcast. The kind of day where everything feels heavy. Alexander stood in front of the window, the letter in his hand. He read it twice, then a third time just to be sure. They had won, sole custody, no conditions. Mark Donovan's rights had been denied. The judge had ruled that stability and well-being mattered more than biological connection. And Liam would stay with Alexander. He turned, found Liam standing in the doorway, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "We won," Alexander said quietly. Liam's breath caught. "Really?" Alexander nodded. "Really?" Liam didn't say anything else. He just crossed the room and hugged him. Tight, like he hadn't hugged anyone in a long time. And Alexander he held on just as tightly. Later that evening, they sat together at the piano. Liam had been practicing slowly, carefully. His fingers stumbled sometimes, but he kept going, and Alexander listened, not because he was trying to fix anything, but because it was enough to be there in that moment. Weeks passed, then months. The rhythm of their lives settled. School for Liam, business for Alexander, dinners at the table, books before bed, and sometimes just quiet. But not the lonely kind, the comfortable kind, the kind that says everything's going to be okay. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander found Liam sitting on the floor of his offices, surrounded by papers, sketch designs. "What are you working on?" Alexander asked. Liam smiled a little sheepishly. "An app." Alexander raised a brow. "An app." Liam nodded. "Yeah. For kids who've been in shelters, it helps them find resources, people who can help." Alexander studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think that's a brilliant idea," Liam grinned. "You do. I do." And just like that, a new chapter began. They worked on it together. Late nights, early mornings. Liam brought the ideas. Alexander brought the experience. They made a good team. By the time the app launched, Liam was 14. Taller. Stronger. More sure of himself. The boy Alexander had found in the cemetery was still there, but he had become something more. Someone more. And Alexander, he wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was something else. Something better. A father. At the launch event, Liam gave a speech. Short. Simple. But powerful. He talked about being lost. About finding family in unexpected places. About building something new from the pieces of the past. Alexander stood in the back of the room watching. Listening. And for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at peace. Afterward, Liam found him. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. Alexander shook his head. "You did this, I just helped." Liam smiled. "Still, thanks." They walked out together into the crisp evening air. The city lights were bright, but not blinding. For once, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt wide open. The seasons changed again, summer fading into autumn, the city slipping into its familiar rhythm of cooler nights and golden leaves. Alexander found himself walking a different path than he had ever imagined. Gone were the endless nights spent alone in boardrooms, the weight of empty success heavy on his shoulders. Now his world was filled with something else's, something far more valuable. He and Liam had carved out a life together. Not perfect, not always easy, but real. On weekends, they took walks through Central Park, sometimes in silence, other times deep in conversation about things Alexander never thought he'd care about. Science projects, soccer matches. Music. Liam was into these days, and every time Alexander caught himself smiling at some sarcastic comment or clever observation from Liam, he realized this was what he'd been missing all those years. One Sunday, as they wandered along a quiet path lined with golden leaves, Liam spoke up. "Do you think Mom would be proud of me?" Alexander stopped walking. His breath left him in a slow exhale. "I know she would," he said. "She'd be proud of the person you are, and the choices you make." Liam nodded slowly, kicking at a loose stone on the path. "I think about her a lot," he admitted. "What she would have said if she was here." Alexander rested a hand on Liam's shoulder. "I think she would have said you're stronger than she ever imagined." They walked in silence after that. But it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that spoke volumes. Later that evening, they sat at the dining table. Liam worked on homework. Alexander glanced over at him between reading emails and reviewing reports. There was a rhythm now, one he hadn't thought possible before. He found himself wondering how he'd lived so long without it. The doorbell rang. Alexander stood, glancing at Liam with a reassuring nod before he answered it. Mark Donovan stood there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He looked different this time, not the polished billionaire who had tried to win a custody battle. Just a man, one who seemed less certain of his power. "I'm not here to fight," Mark said quietly. Alexander stepped aside, letting him in. They walked toward the living room, where Liam had already stood from the table, his eyes watchful, wary but not afraid. Mark's gaze flickered to his son, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "I wanted to say goodbye." Liam frowned. "Goodbye," Mark nodded. "I'm leaving the city, selling off most of my shares, stepping away from the company." Alexander arched a brow. "That doesn't sound like you." Mark gave a small, humorless smile. "It isn't, but it's something I need to do." He turned back to Liam. "I'm not running away. I need to figure out who I am outside of all this." Liam studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Mark's eyes flickered with something Alexander couldn't quite name. "You're a good kid," he said, "and you've got a good man looking out for you." His gaze shifted to Alexander. "I didn't understand that before, but I do now." Alexander gave a brief nod. Mark looked back at Liam one more time. If you ever want to talk, you can find me. But I won't force anything. Liam nodded again. Thanks. And then Mark turned and left. No drama. No threats. Just a quiet exit. Alexander closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, collecting his thoughts. When he turned back, Liam was still standing in the middle of the living room, staring at where his father had been. You okay? Alexander asked. Liam nodded. Yeah, I think so. They sat back down at the table. Liam returned to his homework, but there was something lighter in his expression, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. Days turned into weeks. The air grew colder. Thanksgiving came, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander didn't feel the usual emptiness when the holidays approached. They cooked dinner together. It was a mess. The turkey was overcooked. The mashed potatoes were lumpy, but they laughed about it, sitting at the table surrounded by dishes they probably wouldn't finish. Not bad for two amateurs, Alexander said, lifting his glass. Liam grinned. Speak for yourself. I nailed those rolls. Alexander chuckled, clinking his glass lightly against Liam's. You did. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. And when Christmas rolled around, the penthouse looked different. Warmer. Lights hung in the windows. A tree stood in the corner, decorated with mismatched ornaments they had picked out together. There were gifts under it. Not expensive gadgets or luxury items. Just simple things, thoughtful things. Liam handed Alexander a wrap box on Christmas morning. You have to open it, he said with a grin. Inside was a photo frame, a picture of them, Alexander and Liam, standing side by side in Central Park, smiling. Alexander swallowed hard. This is perfect. I thought you could put it on your desk, Liam said. You know, so you remember what matters. Alexander nodded, his throat tight. Thank you. And in that moment, he realized something. He had spent years chasing things he thought mattered. Deals, profits, prestige. But none of it had ever made him feel like this. Liam had given him something he didn't think he'd ever have. A family. New Year's came, and as the clock ticked closer to midnight, they stood on the balcony, watching fireworks light up the sky over Manhattan. Liam glanced at him. What's your resolution? Alexander thought for a long moment. To be here, he said. Really be here. Liam smiled. Men too. They watched the sky explode with color, side by side, and for the first time in years Alexander wasn't thinking about the next deal, or the next acquisition, or the next battle. He was just home. Sometimes life doesn't give us the ending we planned for, but it offers something better, a new beginning we never saw coming. It's not about where you started, or even about what you lost along the way. It's about what you choose to build with what you have right now. Alexander thought his story was over. He thought the chapters of love, of family belonging, had already closed. But life had one more chapter for him to write. And maybe that's true for all of us. Maybe no matter how broken things feel, no matter how heavy the past weighs on your shoulders, there's always room for something new, something real. Because healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in quiet moments, in small choices, in showing up again and again. And in the end, it's not the deals you make or the empires you build that matter most. It's the people you choose and the people who choose you back. Thank you for watching. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own journey, your own resilience, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Because you never know who's waiting to hear that it's not too late to start again. Until next time, stay strong, stay grounded, and remember, sometimes the best stories are the ones we never expected to tell.